Hello and welcome to Orbiting Brick. Perhaps the second hardest mission in stock ASP behind the Grand Tour, the Jool 5 has been a popular challenge for over a decade now. I've always wanted to try one, but that's not what we're doing today. Instead, I have the New Horizons Planet Pack, which makes some alterations to Kerbal's system. Jool still has 5 moons, but stock moons have been evicted and have been replaced with a different assortment. Going closest to farthest, we have the stock Drez, Duna, and Ike. We then have the new additions of Liouch and Nolus. The new moon system, whilst having its challenges, is far easier than stock due to the lack of large moons like Tylo or Lathe. So to make this more difficult, I'm using a 2.5 times rescale and have a USI life support. And since this makes the mission far more complex, and also I haven't seen a mission done in this way before, I wanted to do this a different way, where I first start with the infrastructure, and eventually I build up to a crude mission. And so, in this video, I'm going to construct a relay network around Jool, in a interesting way that was actually super convenient, and you'll see that later. And so you see the rocket on the launch pad that will deliver these 3 relays. And this vehicle quite possibly could have made it smaller if I was more efficient with it, but I decided not to be. So 7.5 meter diameter core stage, 4 engines from cryo engines on the first stage, as well as those 2 SRBs. So it's pretty powerful on liftoff. I actually had to turn down the throttle on the main engines, however, since that caused a too high thrust to weight ratio. But you see it taking off there. And if you didn't know already, part of the alterations that New Horizons makes is also Kerbin is a moon of the gas giant Sona now. It's about in the same orbital location, but actually adds some complications to interplanetary trajectories, obviously, which I'll see later. But we are currently in flight. Some nice vapor cones on those SRBs there. I'm actually not quite sure what I was doing with the fairing. I've been doing this thing lately where, with the fairings, I try to make the fairing taper between 2 cylindrical sections. If that makes sense, you see why I was... Well, you can see the fairing in front of you, where there's that larger cylindrical section, and a taper to a smaller section, and then the end of the fairing. Again, that might not make sense, but you can see what I'm talking about. Anyways, we're continuing with our burn. And, fairly soon we're going to stage. You can see the sun profile was a bit interesting for this. I had to, so I have to admit I had some difficulties designing this vehicle because I couldn't get enough Delta V on the second stage for some reason. But I just kept adding more to first stage and eventually worked out. You can see the strange looking vessel that's the payload. That's Asparagus stage, transfer stage. There's, I believe, 4 sets of Asparagus fuel tanks, surrounded by another 2 sets, so 8 fuel tanks and then 4 fuel tanks. All of those set up in their Asparagus staging. So basically when one set is drained of fuel, that set detaches and then the next set starts draining, and that means you don't have to carry around empty fuel tanks. So now that we're in orbit, we can plot our maneuvers all the way out to Jool. We're gonna first do a Kerbin escape burn, which is going to gas on a low orbit of Sona, at least one with a low periapsis, since that means we can utilize the Uberth effect to get some additional Delta V. I guess we'll save some additional Delta V, where the maneuver will be more efficient the closer we are to Sona. And if we line the periapsis up with the burn position provided by Kerbal Transfer Window Planner, and that means that we can save Delta V and get a pretty good encounter with Jool. There you go. We don't even have to do a mid-course correction. And then I'm pulling out this fancy tool, Resonant Orbit Calculator. Just look that up on the CCAN and you'll find it. But what this does, well, you can see it shows you the orbit you need for a communication network of however many satellites around whichever planet you want. It adapts to whatever solar system you're using. And what this means is the orbit it shows you is the orbit, well, basically, if you're in that orbit, and you periapsis if you deploy a satellite. Actually, I'll talk about that later. Yeah, the first attempt to conduct a Kerbin escape burn did not go as planned. Kraken attacked it there. But the second attempt went better. We were able to use the second stage to start. Most of its engines ignited successfully. But after the second stage burns out, the singular wolfhound on the transfer stage starts burning. And we actually start off with a very low thrust-to-weight ratio on the transfer stage. I believe it's only 0.2 at the start of the burn. And yeah, RCS isn't even able to get ullage on it, so that causes some difficulties igniting the engine. But eventually it does ignite. There we go. And we're now escaping, well, we're now continuing our escape from Kerbin. And actually, as we do this burn, we're going to adjust in the first, I believe, 2 sets of drop tanks. And now actually briefly pass through the atmosphere due to our low orbit, but that ends up being fine and we were unaffected, although I avoided using a physical time warp due to the Kraken attack that happened previously. But yeah, we re-exit the atmosphere, and can continue on with our burn. And yeah, fairly soon we'll just in that first set of drop tanks. There they go. And yeah, there's still a lot left. There's still a lot of time left in the burn. But eventually we just in that second set of drop tanks. And we are now on our escape course from Kerbin. Now, what I was talking about earlier with the resonant orbit calculator, it means that a periapsis of the orbit it gives you, if you detach a relay at that point and then wait another orbit and detach a relay, and of course they circularize their orbits at periapsis, that means the relays will end up in equally distant space in the same orbit, which means that they can always contact the 2 other relays in the orbit. Again, that'll be visually demonstrated later. But we can deploy the solar panels and antenna of the core transfer stage, which will actually serve as one of the relays. The other 2 are, as you can see, at the top of the vehicle right now. But yeah, that's a very large antenna from JX2 Antenna, I believe is the mod. Very powerful, allows you to communicate across the Kerbal system. I like it. Essentially means that we'd never have to worry about communication issues again. So we then proceed to do untold damage to the solar arrays and antenna by flying through untold micrometeoroids, but the game doesn't simulate that, so we're good, and we can do our Suna escape burn, which is again more efficient because we're at periapsis. And we detach yet more drop tanks, set at a set, and another set. And we finish out the burn, and we're now on our way out of the Suna system. And there we go. Yeah, actually you can see the 2 relays there, with their folded up solar arrays, which are from near future electrics, I believe, and as well as those smaller antennas on them. But now, over 1,000 days later into the mission, after coasting around the sun, we can do our mid-course correction to get our final encounter with Jool. That, yeah, will have a fairly low periapsis, actually lower than what we need for the resonant orbit. But that means we can save Delta V on our Jool insertion burn, since we can't do I mean, there isn't a ton to do a gravity assist off of. I guess I could try gravity assist with one of the other moons. But actually, our eventual Jool insertion burn actually isn't that bad, anyways. So yeah, we probably wouldn't have needed. Oh, yeah, I didn't think it would have been worth it to try and go for a gravity assist. Anyways, yeah, we now have our maneuvers plotted for our operations around Jool. That should get us in the correct resonant orbit. So now we approach Jool. And yeah, just time warping to the maneuver now. And we can begin our insertion burn, which again doesn't take that long. It actually doesn't even use up the next set of drop tanks, except I lied, no it does. Yeah, we still have one set left. And we can then perform another maneuver to get our periapsis to correct height for the resonant orbit. Just adjusting that maneuver there. And then another maneuver to get to correct apoapsis. The actual main thing is the orbital period there, which one annoyance I have with this resonant orbit calculator is that the orbital period is given just in hours, even though in game it ends up including days. So yeah, the numbers don't exactly match up, but eventually I'm give it it's not that bad. I can figure it out anyways, and we got pretty accurate there with the apoapsis. Yeah, we get a nice close flyby of Duna there. And we can then do our periapsis raising maneuver. And there we go. And we can make some small adjustments to that. And we can then perform our maneuver to lower our apoapsis. And expand the final set of drop tanks. But now that we're in our resonant orbit, we can begin to deploy the relays. Once I get this apoapsis correct. So we can deploy the first relay, activate the fancy ion engine on it, using argon propellant instead of xenon from near future technologies, and also deploy its solar rays and antenna, and decide to use solar rays since RTGs, their power diminishes over time, and I just didn't feel like using anything else. I feel like with nuclear reactors that would be just too expensive and too massive. It'd be unfeasible for many reasons. So yeah, just solar rays, they end up working fine because of how large they are. But yeah, we can get our orbit around Jool. And the engine will attempt to melt itself, which I didn't realize would happen. But we survive anyways, and end up in the correct orbital height. Apoapsis and periapsis are a bit off, but the orbital period is correct. And so second relay deploys after one orbit, and as you can see, it will end up in a different position in the same orbit relative to the other satellite. We can always stay in contact. And there it goes, deploying its antenna and solar panels. And it does much the same maneuver. And as you can see, a very nice connection between the two satellites. Right over Jool's atmosphere. And a note, since we're not in a equatorial orbit of Jool, I believe this will mean that we can have better connections from anything in orbit around the moons, since it's less likely for the moon to obstruct the line of sight with the relay. Or at least that's what I tell myself, since I didn't feel like getting an actual equatorial orbit. However, it doesn't change the timing for relays at all. But speaking of that, the last relay, the main craft itself, can get in position, and after some fine-tuning with the RCS, I believe that about completes the constellation, and there you go, a very satisfying triangle. Except, I didn't put enough batteries on the main spacecraft, which quite unsatisfyingly deletes two of the sides of the triangle when it goes behind Jool. However, when you're not looking at the craft, it for some reason doesn't simulate the electric charge, even though I have multiple mods that should simulate that. But yes, that means we're left with this satisfying triangle of communication, meaning that any craft around Jool should hopefully be able to communicate. So yeah, I want to thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Hopefully I'll be able to make another episode in this Jool 5 this series, I guess. But yeah, goodbye.